When the first Englishman landed in Japan 400 years ago, he didn't speak any Japanese.
How do I say? I understand in your language.
But he had to learn Japanese pretty fast in order to avoid, well,
to not get his head chopped off by people with very sharp swords.
And that's why in the new blockbuster Shogun, they made the entire cast learn Japanese, a 400-year-old version of the language that even native Japanese needed subtitles to understand. And they did a good job. But how exactly does Hollywood teach an entire cast a new language? Well, you're about to find out, and you can steal this method to speed up your own learning too.
I had a very good teacher called Yukari. As Blackthorn needed to learn things, she would provide me with...
My name is Olly. I'm a language teacher and author. I speak Japanese myself. I've even written books on Japanese, so you can imagine I was keen to find out exactly how these guys and gals went about learning a very, very difficult language. In case you haven't seen it, Shogun is the incredible story of the first Englishman to sail to Japan and the predictable clash of culture that ensues.
It's about that meeting of people from a disparate range of culture, gender, identity, ethnicity, language, who find common ground.
Blackthorn, the main character in the series, needs to learn Japanese very, very fast, but so does the actor who played him, because most of the dialogue in Shogun is in Japanese, not English, and this is what's so brilliant about Shogun. There's this huge story and reality overlap. The actor has to learn Japanese while playing a character who has to learn Japanese, both with crazy high stakes. Does it get more immersive than this? Well, a certain actor named Cosmo Jarvis got thrown in the deep end. So who is Cosmo Jarvis?
この命をもって吉井虎長によるこの村への慈悲な処罰に抗議いたす。
If you haven't heard of him, Cosmo Jarvis is a British actor currently taking the world by storm. Have you seen these great movies? But for Shogun, he had to tackle something completely new. Japanese. Only it's not Japanese as we know it, it's 400-year-old Japanese, and in real life, Cosmo didn't even speak a word of Japanese. In the story, his character, John Blackthorne, washes up in the Japans, where nobody speaks English, and they don't even know England exists.
お前の国はどこじゃ?
Tell him where you're from.
England. It's an island kingdom 1,000 miles north of Portugal.
イングレスの生まれです。ポルトガルから1000マイル離れた国でございます。
Luckily, Blackthorne is a real 17th century aspiring polyglot. He speaks English, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin. No Japanese though, although his Portuguese might come in handy a little bit later. But before we get to Blackthorne, who may or may not be a pirate, I want to know, how on earth do you cope when you're the only English actor on set?
It made the job of the actor portraying Blackthorne a hell of a lot easier, because so much communication was done without language during the process. We embraced the fact that we couldn't really communicate. We wanted to, because Toranaga and Blackthorne build their understanding without words.
Yeah, so right from the start, there's this parallel. While Cosmo learns his Japanese lines to be Blackthorne, it mirrors a realistic immersion experience right down to speaking Japanese in a British accent. And it can be scary being the only one in the room who can't speak the language. I've experienced that many times before, just not in Hollywood. But don't feel sorry for Cosmo. Not being able to understand Japanese resulted in one very important thing. He had something huge in common with his character.
It sort of helped lubricate the demands of the scenes from a, I guess, dramatic perspective. There was so much that was just happening anyway because I didn't understand anybody.
When you watch the show, you really feel that total beginner tension. But Blackthorne had a trick up his sleeve.
そなたは日の本の言葉をまずまず喋れるそうじゃな。私の言うてることがわかるか?
はい。優しい言葉お使いいただくようお願いいたします。
手習い済みの挨拶か。気の回ることじゃ。
She's right that it's a smart move. Prepared phrases can at least get you talking in the language, and this is really fun to do in real life. You should try it out. Write yourself down a few little scripts that you can practice before you go into a situation in the country or with a native speaker. Trust me, and you're going to love the part about the Shogun script, but we'll get to that a bit later. Now, it's not always possible to live in a place where they speak the language you're learning, and Cosmo couldn't do immersion the normal way because nobody speaks samurai Japanese anymore. Besides, Shogun was filmed in Vancouver, not in Japan. But when you have no option of your first language, that is powerful. So maybe try to create this scenario for yourself. How can you give yourself a complete immersion environment in the language you're learning where English cannot be used? There are a few ways.
Blackthorne was in a pretty convenient position of being able to learn
as the script required him to learn. So that's what he did.
And this is what you did.
I wonder how good he gets at the language in the end. Well, you'll have to wait and see. By the way, have you subscribed to this channel yet? You really, really should. It's full of exciting stories like this, all about languages from around the world. So click those buttons and wait to see what happens, and you'll also get served up the next video like this when it comes. So Cosmo couldn't go to Japan where he'd get his inspiration. So what did he do? Well, little hint. Shogun was based on a book.
The book was a very useful document, and I absorbed it incrementally as it became appropriate to what the script was incrementally demanding of Blackthorn. But it was always a useful document, even from the point of view of learning details about Blackthorn's inner thoughts that weren't necessarily ever going to be conveyed in dialogue in the script.
What can I say? Reading is powerful magic. I know because I learned Japanese that way, and it was not easy. I had to figure out on my own that reading is the only way to really make the language stick in my brain. But I've never attempted an antique version of a language. If I did, well, I would probably start by reading some old stories from that country in English first, just to let the culture seep into my mind a little bit, just to start to understand what I'm dealing with. And then the language would make a lot more sense afterwards because I've got something to map it onto. Now, one thing about acting that's harder than real life is that you have a very short time frame to learn foreign lines that have to be delivered perfectly. And since Cosmo couldn't speak Japanese, how did he learn his lines?
I had a very good teacher called Yukari who would, as Blackthorn needed to learn things, she would provide me with the phonetics, and I would pick up things from many of the Japanese crew we were working with, and the more the series progressed, the more he would have to learn as his command of the language improved. So, but it was a kind of a different learning things phonetically, and then trying to marry the sounds of the language with the thoughts associated with the sounds the words in Japanese mean. It was messy, but I had a good teacher.
They also hired dialect coaches to help him because even practicing a language phonetically is not easy. Have you ever tried? It's hard. You've got to really focus on pronunciation and accent to become this believable character.
But you sounded Japanese so great. Sometimes too good. Too, like a native. And then I said, no, don't let him practice a lot. Yeah.
Oh, it's too much.
Well, because maybe you're a musician, so you have great ear.
Wait, he's a musician? I feel some kinship with Cosmo. See, he even admitted that he often felt like he was back in school cramming for the most challenging exam of his life. Tell me, what's the toughest language you've ever tried to learn? Let me know in the comments. I'm going to read through and see what you think.
Blackthorn is constantly searching people's faces for information rather than trying to pretend that he will understand what they're saying. And so it sort of seemed to encourage that discipline of communication.
This is so inspiring. Cosmo used his lack of Japanese skills to understand how hard his character was having it. He even then avoided learning exactly what the Japanese characters were saying until the later episodes after he'd learned some Japanese. It's just like real life. And I have to say, especially as a multilingual person myself, this must have been a fascinating project and frustrating at the same time. But the beauty is that his confused face was real. He didn't have to act that part. As for Blackthorn himself, well, let's just say some characters try to get in the way of his language learning.
聞いたか人間様の言葉を話しよるこいつは賢い犬じゃのよしじゃあ教えてやろうオラは犬じゃ言ってみろオラは犬じゃオラは犬じゃそうだ
Never trust a translator who doesn't like you. And the whole show is like this. Two languages side by side. The characters can't understand each other, so there's always a third party translating, and they're not always honest. That's why Blackthorn has to rely pretty heavily on body language to try to guess what they're saying. Cosmo even said this is realistic because when you watch someone's face and hear their tone, you can understand a lot, even if you don't know the language. And this is especially true in Japan, where, I don't know, for me, at least 50% of the reality of what's being said is communicated through facial expressions and body language and stuff like that. So what do we have now? Well, both Cosmo and his character struggling through, making mistakes and gradually improving their Japanese over time. It's 100% all-in immersion, and I don't care who you are, that's going to make you learn very fast.
If it had to be that Blackthorn was appearing to have learned something, I would repeat and repeat, and I would ask you,
yeah,
and ask anybody that spoke Japanese, if it sounded okay, and yeah.
Sounds like he was unstoppable, but it's not the only time he's done this, by the way, trying to sound as authentic as possible. Can you recognize this accent?
You know what you said the other day, Dempna, about the money after Flanagan was done?
Really, no? You want to talk about that? No, we don't have time for it. Come on, let's go.
I need that money.
I'm not following here.
Don't feel up to it today, Dimpna.
Nice Irish accent there. When Cosmo was learning his role as an Irishman, he hung out in Irish pubs and refused to stop speaking with an Irish accent, even offset, for the entire time it took to make the movie.
I'm going to make this right. I'm going to make it all right.
Which is great, because when you force yourself to mimic an accent, it teaches your muscle memory how the language should feel in your mouth. Plus, you're connecting emotionally with the culture too. That's a big tip for you if you want to really adopt a certain persona in another language. Do what the actors do. Go full on. Become that person. Imitate your favorite heroes from movies. It's really the best way to start getting the language into your bones. But how's this for commitment? Cosmo had this crazy idea while they were filming. He said, if we're using old Japanese, we have to also use Old English, and he went digging to see what 1600s English would sound like. So why did he change his mind? Let's see if we can guess.
The poor man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that Pacian merit are the unworthy takes when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin.
If you understood that without rewinding, well, good for you, and good for Cosmo not forcing 1600s English on us. I'm not sure my brain wants to decode two dead languages at once. Now, I'm not going to tell you if they ever end up deciding that he's a pirate or not, but I did promise you a song, so here goes.
Pissed in my hammock yesterday, so I'll sleep on the floor.
Great song by Cosmo Jarvis, definitely not by Blackthorn. By the way, if you want to become the hero of your own language adventure, it makes perfect sense to learn through stories, just like Cosmo did. And I know that the best way to do that is with StoryLearning. You see, here at StoryLearning, we teach languages, including Japanese, from scratch by immersing you in an exciting story so that you can feel part of the culture from day one. There's no acting required, but you'll learn a ton of good lines. It's the most natural way that you can learn a language, and it's a lot of fun as well. So if you want to know more, check out my free StoryLearning kit linked in the video description below, or you can scan the QR code if you're watching on your TV, and you'll see exactly how this amazing method works and how you can use it to learn Japanese or any other language for that matter. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this yet, minor complication. You see, all English in this show is actually Portuguese. Wait, what?
On your way to the castle, Father. As you know, I've had no word.
As soon as Toranaga calls on me to permit the black ship to depart, you will be the first to know.
That's what I'm worried about, see?
I tell you what, English, we're coming into port soon. When are you going up there? Come on, tell me what you see.
You're hearing English, but really, in reality, they're speaking Portuguese, and there's a lot of this in the show. Why? Well, in those days, Portuguese was the main trade language in Japan, and since Blackthorn could speak it, the producers decided to help us to connect better with him in a language that we all understand, English.
You're in the court of Lord Yoshii Toranaga, and I am the interpreter to the Council of Regents.
Oh, good, so you'll be able to twist my words in your Portuguese favor.
Meanwhile, a bunch of other characters were speaking Spanish, Dutch, and Latin, so the producers made the fascinating decision to render all of the non-Japanese languages as English. And if you've watched Shogun, I bet you are probably quite grateful for this. But as I hinted at the start, Cosmo Jarvis wasn't alone in this express language learning adventure.
Your character is, among other things, an interpreter.
Yes.
And how many languages do you speak?
Sadly, only two.
Two. Well, that's one more than I do.
Anna Sawai is the leading lady in Shogun, but just because you're Japanese doesn't mean you know what the heck your lines mean.
Scripts, people, dialogues, and the language was actually hard for me to understand in Japanese, so I have to study it.
In case you didn't catch this yet, the most amazing thing about the Japanese in Shogun is that even Japanese people needed subtitles in order to follow it. Think Shakespearean English, but for Japanese.
Like a Shakespeare English. It's hard to young actors who has no experience with samurai drama, including Mariko. It was her first experience playing the samurai period. I taught them intonation, phrasing, rhythm, tone.
Even for Japanese actors, it's so hard. Like a Shakespeare English for you guys.
And it's not just that 1600s Japanese was full of words that nobody uses anymore. The whole way they spoke was different from modern Japanese. If you love languages, you probably realize just how impressive this is. On top of this challenge, Anna, who is originally from New Zealand, had to speak her English lines in a British accent.
I am happy to see you have changed your mind about bathing.
And on top of that, she even chose certain words where she'd put on a little bit of a Japanese accent.
Just getting used to periodic Japanese was pretty hard because I've been speaking Japanese for 30 years. I don't know. And then on top of that, I'm also speaking in a British accent with a little bit of Japanese accents here and there. So juggling those two, it did take some time to get used to.
You think that's impressive? Well, guess what? The entire Japanese cast had to learn to speak this way, and they didn't just wing it, they went all in.
I feel like, it was a dream East meets West project.
So how did they do it? Well, first off, to keep it as authentic as possible, most of the actors came directly from Japan.
大阪に戻り、大老評議に双心なき旨を改めて誓い宣言を受けようとのたしである。何もかも誤解でござる。
We wanted in this show the very best actors we could possibly get. And to work with the best actors and ask them to speak a language that was not their own felt like it was going to start by tying one hand behind their back.
Makes sense, right? They couldn't use many Japanese American actors because most are English speakers. As if that's not enough, Hollywood brought in an almost entirely Japanese crew, the directors, set designers, even the chefs.
Even enlisting armies of Japanese specialists to train the actors on movement and speech.
The actors even read the novel that the story is based on so that they could really feel the language come alive. They spent ridiculous hours rehearsing with their language coaches.
階級の動き、また女性のお姫様から一般の方たちのすべての立ち居振る舞いの動作、言葉遣い、あらゆる礼儀作法。
Now, who is still complaining about learning words in another language here? Not me. Mind you, picking up another language is not rocket science when you're forced to do it in real life every single day. Some things get lost in translation, but you figure it out as you go along, and then you never forget.
分かっておる。でも適宜いらない。欲しいのは炭、欲しい炭の方が温かい。
I must say, I am impressed. You have made your own way out here.
But here comes the most impressive part of all, and feel free to butt in if you don't agree with this, just let me know in the comments. How in the world did they get a period Japanese script out of a novel written in English?
あれは人食い族なのか通じ。偉人の中には人を食うものがおると虎長が言うとった。
私にもわかりません若君。とはいえ念のため。If
it's not obvious yet, Shogun is a show about translation, but the real-life translating part was no joke. It was painstaking. Try counting all these steps here, see if you can follow me. First, they wrote the script in English. Then they sent it to Tokyo for translation into modern Japanese, and then it went to a Japanese playwright who magically turned it into period Japanese, which wasn't easy because she had to make it sound natural for actors. Next came the polishing.
So many times back and forth, back and forth. First of all, writer wrote the English version and then go to translator and then go to drama writer and then go to the historical expert checking and then come back. And then we check the dialogues and matching for each character or situation, then retranslate to English back to Justin.
Amazing. And the script took years to write, passing back and forth like this. They even kept tweaking the dialogue on set. And is that all? No, it's not. They still had to very carefully translate it back into English for the subtitles, which they did in an interesting way. And here's where it gets really, really crazy.
My lord would like to say that he is sorry for the time you spent in prison.
Later in the same episode, Lady Mariko becomes Blackthorn's primary translator.
I'm grateful to be alive.
And what's interesting is how she subtly alters the conversation.
See why the subtitles are essential here? Mariko usually cheats a bit when she interprets, twisting words into what she wants the other person to hear.
This is not in our lord's interest.
I'm sorry, were you going to translate?
Honestly, the whole act of translation is a drama itself, and us, well, we're in the same boat as Blackthorn, aren't we?
Translation means more than a relaying of words, and the show wants us to think about that. After all, Blackthorn isn't the only English speaker being translated to here. So are we, the English-speaking audience.
You watch a lot of foreign films, usually the subtitles aren't whatever the script says, but for Shogun, they didn't do that. Instead, they wrote exactly what the actors were really saying because sometimes those actors went rogue.
Each actor has their own idea, so we should adjust on set as well.
Apparently when you hear Blackthorn cussing, well, that's Cosmo Jarvis totally improvising.
You should tell this milk-dribbling me I'm ready to go.
心得違いがあったと。丁重に詫びておられまする。
But thank goodness he didn't also have to try to do a Portuguese accent for his Portuguese lines. We all know accents are hard enough to decipher when they're real. Ask anyone who's watched this hilarious video about the amazing accent of the US.